Hello, welcome back to an On Fire Garbage Can. I am your host, Lainey. Today, we're going to be talking about the Netflix miniseries Unorthodox. I filmed my Gemini season look today, and I thought, well, I'm already wearing makeup, why not talk about something? So, Unorthodox is about a young Hasidic Jewish woman named Esther, her name is Esty, living in a Hasidic Jewish community in a borough of New York City. And it's basically about her life there and then her eventual leaving this community and going to Berlin. It's based off of a memoir by a woman named Deborah Feldman, who actually she did grow up in a Hasidic Satmar community, and she did leave. And she has I read the memoir after I watched the show because I was so intrigued. And a lot of her her life in New York is based off of her experiences. And once she leaves, that it's completely different. So like her SDAT in New York is pretty close to Deborah's experiences, and but once she leaves, it's completely different. So they're Hasidic Satmar Jews, which is a specific community in New York City. They're like kind of like the strictest of the Hasidic Jews. So it was founded by I think it was founded during World War II by Holocaust survivors. So a lot of the people there are descendants of actual people who like lived in concentration camps and escaped Europe during World War II. This is a community founded out of this deep horrific trauma, so a lot of the way they like live and interact is out of this fear that the Holocaust could happen again. So it's not like unfounded because antisemitism is a thing. But Deborah Feldman talked about how she felt her entire life that any moment the Holocaust could happen again, and this is how these people lived. So the reason they were very strict in their religious, very just like extremists, they like took very strict interpretations of the Torah and the Talmud, is because they believed that if they lived devoutly, then God would never punish them again for the Holocaust. These people also were very distrustful of outsiders, and they actually address this in the series, where during like Passover, Esty's grandfather talks about how they used to trust other people, and that came to bite them in the back, which is how like in the World War II and in the Holocaust, a lot of people were betrayed by their neighbors, like were turned in and stuff like that. So these people, it's just a lot of trauma that's been passed down. So they really rely on each other. They're very close-knit. And I know I've like done a lot of research on Judaism. I find Judaism really fascinating, especially like Orthodox Judaism and Hasidic Judaism, really fascinating. And in Judaism, the home is a very important thing, so they're very focused on getting married and having children. If the home is very important, then women are the foundation of the home, and their job is to take care of the most important thing in their culture. Oh, something else that's interesting in Orthodox and Hasidic Judaism, they're supposed to keep their heads covered, so men wear like the things on their heads and the hats. Women cover their head, or they wear wigs to cover their hair. In Satmar Hasidic Judaism, they shave their heads to like follow the strictest interpretation of their religious texts, and they wear wigs to cover their hair. So once you get married, if you're a married woman, you have to cover your hair, but if you're a man, you have to like cover it all the time. And they have the peyos, which is the curls that come down in the front of their ears. Oh, very fascinating. I find it so interesting. Esty was an outcast from the beginning. I think that she was always destined to leave. Esty was raised by her grandparents. She was very close to. She was very close to, especially to her grandmother. She was pretty much raised by her aunt and her grandparents. She did have a father, but he had a lot of problems with alcoholism, and her mother left their community when she was very young. So Esty always had this sense of abandonment because for her entire life she'd been told that her mother left her. which like really made her want to cling to the people in her community because she didn't have a mother and her father was like long gone. But she was also still kind of, she felt kind of rejected because of that happening in her family. So she's both trying to cling to the people in her community, but also kind of felt rejected, but like she couldn't hold on. And Esty loved music. She was learning to play the piano with one of the women who rented out the building that her grandfather owned. She also loved to sing. Women are actually not allowed to sing in their community because in one of the religious texts it says that if a man hears a woman sing, that it can make a man lustful. And the women and men are very like separated. Like even if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, like in the wedding scene where the men and women can't dance each other. Even if you're married, you can't dance with your spouse. They're like separated by a literal like rope. That's pretty much how it is the entire time. You can pretty much only touch someone of the opposite sex unless they're a member of your family, and husbands and wives don't touch each other in public. So it's like very private. There's this thing called, I think it's called Nita, which is basically when a woman is on her period, she's not allowed to touch her husband because she's considered unclean, and for like the week that she's on her period and then 7 days after, she cannot touch her husband and they cannot have sex. And then she goes to the mikvah where she takes this like renewal bath and is clean again and can be with her husband. And the idea behind this is that if you can only touch your spouse 2 weeks out of the month, then the 2 weeks that you can't touch, you have to communicate with each other. It's supposed to foster like this intellectual relationship between each other, and then it also like makes the tension grow, it makes the heart grow fonder. In the book, this is really hard for Deborah because she has to go between not being touched at all by her husband, between him always like being on her, and it's very hard for her, like the back and forth. It damages her self-esteem a lot. And in the book, Deborah has a lot of negative feelings for mikvah, whereas some women really like, I've watched some videos by Jewish women, some women really like mikvah and they love the concept of it, and to Deborah it felt very invasive and oppressive, and it really was hard on her sense of self. But they don't really go into that with Esty. And so Esty is marrying this man named Yankee. The changes between Deborah's husband in the book, in the memoir, and her husband, the Yankee character in the show, are different. In the show, they make a very conscious effort to try to make Yankee a sympathetic character, in that like he's trying to do what's right, but like what he's been told is right. Whereas in the book, her husband is not as good as a man as Yankee. In the show, he's more just misguided, but like deep down he's a good person, but he's just a little bit misguided. In the book, he's abusive. They have a very toxic relationship. I think they made that change for the show because I don't think they wanted to portray Hasidic husbands as like necessarily abusive, and I also think they wanted to show that just because Yankee is good to Esty, that she doesn't have to stay. Like, I think if they made him like a horrible man, then you'd be like, of course Esty wants to leave, he's married to an abusive man. But in the show, it's like he's still kind of a good guy, so like for a split second you're like, oh, I want her to stay with him because he's a good guy, but then you realize that's not what Esty wants. And so it makes you really consider what Esty wants. Just like, she shouldn't have to stay with someone just because they're a good person. So Esty marries this man named Yankee, and they do actually like each other. The wedding scene is like a very happy scene. I saw a lot of people criticizing how they show that there's no happiness in Esty's life in her community, which I don't think is necessarily true. If it's from her point of view, and if the way it looks is sad, that's because that's how Esty feels, because this is a TV show and perspective is a very important thing. So if this is Esty feeling sad, of course the surroundings are going to feel sad, but that doesn't necessarily mean the community is sad. Also, the wedding is a very happy moment for Esty in the show because she's been told her entire life that being married will make her happy, so why should she be happy on her wedding day? And I think the wedding is actually a very happy moment for her and Yankee and her entire family. So I don't think that's necessarily accurate. So they get married. They have a lot of trouble consummating their marriage because it's very painful for Esty. So they go months without actually having sex because Esty is having problems with that, and she has a lot of anxiety around sex, and she is diagnosed with vaginismus, which is like intense pain when you try to have sex. So she like spends a lot of her first year being married just trying to have sex, which is really hard on their relationship because Yankee tells his like mom about it, and then his mom tells Esty's like family. So literally their entire families are very involved in their sex life, which makes Esty even more anxious. And her aunt really tells her that she won't have any leverage in their marriage until she gets pregnant, which I think is really hard for Esty. They eventually do have sex, and it's very painful for Esty. And I think the scene where they do consummate their marriage is like the biggest indication of why Esty could never be happy with Yankee, because he might be a good guy, but basically she's in this intense amount of pain, and he doesn't really seem concerned with the fact that she isn't enjoying it and that she's like in pain, and he's like, wow, that was amazing, and he's very dismissive of her feelings. I think that's just one of the biggest reasons why Esty could never stay there, because he cared about her, but like in that moment it was just very selfish of him. So Esty does get pregnant, and she's excited because she's like, this is what I wanted. And in their belief, they believe that you need to have big families because they want to make up for the amount of Jewish people that died during the Holocaust, the 6 million people who died, who were murdered. And so their community is based on the fact that they're trying to rebuild this like large population of Hasidic Jews, which is why there's a lot of control on the women, because if they're the ones rebuilding the population, there's this afraid that if you like lose the women, if you lose the cleanliness of the women, it will affect that future. So which is why there's a lot of control on the women in these communities. So then Esty gets pregnant, she's really happy, she's about to tell Yankee, and he's like, I want a divorce, because he's being influenced by his family. He's just a mama's boy who doesn't really stand up for himself. And Esty's very upset because she's like, I did all this for you, and now you want to divorce me, and she doesn't tell him that she's pregnant. So her mother, earlier, before Esty got married, her mother brought her these papers that were like, so her mother was British. Her mother grew up in England, and then she had German parents, but she was Jewish. So her mother was Jewish but wasn't raised Hasidic, and then she got married to Esty's father in New York and moved there and became Hasidic. And so Esty's mom is like, you have a right to German citizenship, so if you ever need to get out of here, you can go to Germany. And Esty's like, I'm never gonna need that. So fast forward, Esty's been married a year, she's like, okay, I'm going to Germany because I'm pregnant and my husband doesn't want me anymore. So she escapes and she flies to Germany, she flies to Berlin, which was where her mom lives. And basically she runs into these music students, very like diverse group of music students from all over the world, from like African countries. There's a girl from Palestine, people from Berlin, and she's just kind of amazed because they've been raised with this idea that the Germans were like demonized. They were demonized. They literally, like, Deborah talked about how she like was told that Hitler had like was a demon sent from the devil to punish the Jewish people, and they believed that all Germans were bad, and this is just, they were born out of trauma. So when Esty goes to Berlin, she has to return to like the center of her like intergenerational trauma in order to move past it. And she's so surprised that like it's like full of life and all these things. And it's just this, a lot of the show, you wouldn't notice it at first, but a lot of the show is about trauma and about how she goes back to Berlin and she's like, how this city has like moved on and has become like multicultural, and these people are using music to express themselves, whereas the Satmar Jews are so terrified about the prospect of another Holocaust, that they're just clinging so tightly to their fears, which is a very interesting way to show how these different places process trauma. But it's also different because Berlin is technically, when you think about it, Berlin is the oppressor and the Jews were the oppressed, so like how the different, like the power structures of how the different groups react. So back in Williamsburg, everyone's like, we need to get Esty. So they're like talking to Yankee, and they're like, take your cousin Moisha, who's bad news. Moisha's bad news. And he's like, Moisha, who recently left the community and is now back, trying to like be like, I'm a Jew again. And they're like, if you go do this is you trying to prove yourself that you can come back. And so Moisha is not a good guy. He's involved in gambling and all these things. So they go to Germany. They track down Esty. Things that I liked about the show. Well, first of all, I didn't know a lot about Hasidic culture. So that was interesting. They also didn't spend a lot of time explaining. They would talk a lot about their culture, but they didn't really explain a lot of things. So, like, when she shaved her head, I was like, I don't know what's going on. So I had to do a lot of research. Like, I'd be like, what's going on? And I have to, like, Google it while I was watching it. Whereas if you were, like, raised Orthodox or something like that, you'd probably just be like, oh, I know what that is. Whereas I wasn't. So I'm like, oh, what's that? Which is, like, making me learn more about Jewish culture, which I think is a really cool effect of this show. Like, wanting people to learn more about this culture. The show's also almost entirely in Yiddish, which is very similar to German. I took German for 3 years, and I'd be like listening, I'd be like, wait, I know that word, I know what they're saying, because Yiddish and German are very similar, which is part of the reason why Deborah Feldman moved to Berlin, because it was like not really a language difference there, because the community in Williamsburg, they speak English, but their main language is Yiddish. They pretty much only speak English so that they can survive when they talk to outsiders, or, but their main language is Yiddish. And Yiddish is kind of a dying language, and Yiddish art is also kind of dying. But the show's almost entirely in Yiddish, which is, like, so cool. There's, like, subtitles, and, like, some people don't like subtitles. If you don't like subtitles, that's your opinion. I like subtitles. I watch it even when I watch shows in English. However, I find that when I watch shows with subtitles, I like pay more attention, because I'm like, I have to pay attention to what's going on the screen because I have to read it. So, like, it's a good way to make the watcher more invested in the story. And we binge watched the miniseries in one night because we just had to keep watching. And it's also very interesting because it's not it's non-chronological, so you don't see Esty's life and then her leaving. It starts with her leaving, and then you see flashbacks, which I think is also very interesting. I saw a lot of, I watched, like, videos about the series, like, by actual Jewish people, because, like, I wanted to make sure that this show wasn't, like, false, and I read the memoirs based off of. Pretty much a lot of the stuff you saw is pretty accurate to what I read in the memoir. So some stuff was changed, but not a lot. And the things in the specific to Satmar Hasidic Jewish culture, as far as I know, were pretty accurate, because Deborah Feldman was raised there, so she just wasn't spreading inaccuracies about things. Oh, the acting was really good. Shira Haas, who played Esty, she's amazing. Some of them have phones, but they're not, like, smartphones. They're, like, Blackberries, just for, like, emergencies only. So they don't have a TV, I don't think. They don't really have technology. So, like, Esty, when she leaves, she's very unprepared for the outside world. She's not really capable of, like, finding a job in the modern world, which is, like, also interesting. I watched a lot of Hasidic interviews, and it's very interesting because a lot of people talk about how, like, in some cases, like, a lot of the women are housewives, but there are also a lot of women who work, because the men's job, they study a lot, so a lot of times the women work and they get educated. Whereas in the Satmar community, the way Deborah Feldman talked, she didn't really talk about how education was common. She didn't really say that education was common among women, but I watched some other interviews for Hasidic communities that weren't Satmar. It was very common for women to get an education. which is interesting. So, like, when you think about it, Esty was living in one of the most strict forms of Hasidic Judaism. One person that I watched who was Jewish, I don't think she's an Orthodox Jew or Hasidic Jew, she's just Jewish. But her entire channel was about being Jewish, so I thought that was interesting. Pointed out that she wished that they would show Esty going to seeing different parts of Jewish culture, like Orthodox Jews, or I don't know what it's called, like when you are practicing Jew but you're not as strict, to show how she could still be Jewish and not have to be Hasidic Satmar, which I think is really interesting. I mean, I think that would have been interesting, but I think that almost would have it would have made the story a little bit longer. And they spend so much time already showing us so much of Jewish culture that I think if they were showing us Jewish culture in Berlin, I think it would have been too much on the story, where it just needed to show Esty experiencing the world. But I do think that would be an interesting concept later. A lot of people were like a lot of Jewish people I saw really liked the show, and were just like, this is just one girl's story. Whereas some people thrive in the Hasidic community, some people are just not right for it, and they have to leave, and like that's okay. Like, we're individuals, you can make your own choices. I just find Jewish culture really fascinating, really fascinating. And so now I'm like, I want to watch other Jewish shows, especially ones that aren't in English, because I think those are more interesting probably. Because there's not a lot of American Jewish shows. I really like the miniseries. I would definitely suggest checking it out, regardless of what religion you are. But if you're Jewish, definitely check it out. I also watched Yentl recently. It's a musical movie starring Barbra Streisand and Mandy Patinkin, which is also about a Jewish woman and how she's restricted because of her gender. Because women aren't allowed to study the Talmud, it's only men. And she is really intelligent. She loves her religion and she just wants to learn more about it. She wants to debate all this stuff, and she can't because she's a woman. So it's like the story of Mulan, essentially, where she disguises herself as a man to learn, which is less about her. It's so funny because that story isn't about her escaping her community or her religion. It's more about her thrusting herself into her religion. And so it's the opposite of Unorthodox. They're very similar but different in that way. They have the same core message of like, you need to just like be your own person. So I also loved Yentl. It's on YouTube for free. I watched it for the first time. I thought it was great. It's like a fun watch movie. Barbra Streisand could literally do anything. Watch media about Jewish people and support those stories in the media so that other people can learn about it. So let's do that. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks